As Trent mentioned, I'm an economist. You folks probably all know the definition of an economist. Somebody who's good with numbers but doesn't have the personality to be an accountant. That's why we have Tiffany on the program later, so we have somebody with a little personality. You know, I never thought I would be involved in Columbia River Crossing. I think all of us who are on the panel tonight came to it reluctantly, and it's been an education. And I think what we want to do tonight is share with you some of the facts, some of the things that we've uncovered in our work. And I know economics isn't everybody's favorite discipline, so I'll try and make this as interesting and accessible as I can and give you some of the highlights behind the financing of the Columbia River Crossing. Because while everybody's focused on how nice it would be to have a big new structure, hopefully that somebody else paid for, it has to get paid for in some way. And the people who pay for it, a lot of you are sitting in this room, but it's really the taxpayers of Oregon and Washington that will ultimately bear the burden. So before we start on this project, we should really know what the financial risks are, and that's what I'll be talking about tonight. So first, let me just quick overview of what I'll talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about highway traffic projections, and they're really important because they're how this project gets paid for. I'll talk about money that's expected to come from the federal government and whether that's likely or not. I'll talk about the ability of the two states to afford funding of the project, and then finally I'll talk about the risk of cost overruns. So let's just talk about traffic and toll forecasts. They are really at the heart of the financing of this project because most of the project, a good share of the project, is designed to be paid for from tolls that people will pay using the I-5 bridge. Not just when it's completed, but as soon as the project is approved, within a year or two, if it is approved, the existing bridge will have tolls added to it. So that'll be an important component of how it's paid for. And the forecasts both are a way to pay for the tolls, are a way to pay for the project, but they're also the justification for expanding the project from the existing 6-lane bridge that we have, 3 lanes in each direction, to a structure that's designed for 6 lanes in each direction, a total of 12 lanes. And just as an aside, ignore what you've been told about being a 10-lane structure. They've designed it to be wide enough at more than 90 feet to hold 12 lanes of traffic. And their forecast basically is, and the vertical line on this chart is where we are right now, is that traffic in this region will continue to grow very steadily. In fact, will grow faster than it's grown in the last decade. And so today about 127,000 cars per day go over the bridge. They're predicting that by 2030, 184,000 vehicles per day will go over the bridge. And that's why we need a big new bridge, because 184,000 vehicles going over the existing bridges would cause catastrophic slowdowns. The trouble with that forecast is it's simply wrong. What's happened to traffic is that since over the last decade, traffic levels on the I-5 bridges have been going down. Their forecast is that red line. That's through 2030. That's what they think will happen. But in reality, what is happening is traffic flows over the bridge peaked in 2005 and are now in the same levels they were in the 1990s. So we're not going to see that big increase in traffic. And this isn't some isolated or local phenomenon. This is a national phenomenon. And it's also true of truck traffic as well. So truck traffic on the I-5 bridges is down about 23% since 2006, again, that peak year. And driving is down in the United States. The average number of miles that Americans are driving has been declining steadily since the mid part of the last decade. So the underlying force, the reason for building this bridge and the way you're going to pay for it, isn't a reliable source of money. Now, anybody who knows anything knows the reason that all those trends turned down after 2005. Before 2005, you could buy gasoline in this country for about $1 or $1.25 a gallon. And anybody who could buy gasoline, you know, everybody would love to live in a world where you could do that. But today, as you all know, we're paying $3.50 a gallon of gas, and that is not going to go back to $1 or $1.25 anytime soon. And so these numbers are really based on outdated data and outdated models. The data that predicts where people will travel and how much they will travel dates back to the 1990s. The model that they created was based on traffic in 2005, just when gas prices were starting to increase, and they haven't bothered to update that model in the 7 years since the base data was collected. Anybody who makes a decision thinking that the world is going to be based on $1 or $1.25 gallon gasoline is going to make a serious mistake about transportation, and that's what's going on here. So gas prices, again, calibrated at very low levels. And as we all know, gas prices used to be, this is just, as an economist, I have to put the data up on the screen. That's what gas prices look like. I know you all know this stuff. It's $3.50 a gallon right now. The other thing we know is that the models that they use to predict future traffic can't accurately predict traffic on facilities that are tolled. So right now, as we all know, the bridges and the highways in the Portland metropolitan area and here in Vancouver are not tolled. So nobody has any experience with how much will people drive if we put a toll on a facility. Well, the Oregon Department of Transportation's own consultants, the same people who developed these models, and I'll just summarize this report for you, said the models that we use now to predict traffic don't work on tolled bridges and highways. So they know already that the projections that they're making are wrong. And the state treasurer hired the world expert on traffic forecasting to come in, look, and he said, same problem, that the models are simply wrong. And we haven't had yet what's called an investment grade analysis. And an investment grade analysis is basically what the bond buyers who will buy bonds that are backed by tolls will insist on before they will buy the bonds, and they will have a much lower level of traffic forecast than what's been done so far. Now, we have a little bit of experience in the state of Washington with tolling. Those of you who know the Seattle area probably know that the floating bridge across Lake Washington, SR 520, started being tolled about a year ago. This is the forecast of what happens when you put a toll on an existing bridge, about a 35 or 40% decline in traffic. If that happens with the I-5 bridges, that means dramatically less revenue than they're predicting from tolling, because people will use alternative routes. And when you look at other estimates that have been prepared by the Washington Department of Transportation, they're talking about tolling a replacement tunnel to replace the existing Alaska Way viaduct. And for years, the Washington Department of Transportation told anyone who would listen that they could get $400 million to help pay for that tunnel if you tolled the tunnel. And then after they signed the contracts, they then said, oh no, we can only get, we think, maybe $200 million from tolling the tunnel. But I have to tell you that this article, which is about a year old now, is wrong, because they've revised their estimate of how much money they can get from tolling down still further. And now it's about $160 million that they might get from tolling, except that that would probably create intolerable diversion and traffic jams in downtown Seattle. So the folks who are counting on to give us the accurate estimates of how much toll revenue you can get from this facility have been proven to be wrong in all of the instances in which they've done it. You can't rely on their estimates. And as you probably all know, Lake Washington, the folks who commute back and forth across Lake Washington from Seattle to the east side to jobs in Redmond and Bellevue, work for companies like Microsoft, and a lot more of them are very high income, and as a result can easily afford to pay the tolls. So even there, where traffic is down about a third from the pre-toll levels, it's a very high income group of people. The people using the I-5 bridges are, unfortunately, although we might like to be, are not as well off as the folks commuting across Lake Washington. So the tolls are a huge risk to this project. Let me talk about federal highway funding. This project assumes that we'll get about $400 or $500 million as an earmark from the federal government. The trouble is the Federal Highway Trust Fund, because of the fact that we're driving less every year, is getting less and less money. So it's actually in the red right now, and the federal government is providing less money to the states than it has in the past for highways. And the argument has been made that the CRC will somehow qualify for a special pot of money, a special earmark. In fact, what happened in the last highway reauthorization bill last summer is Congress eliminated all the funding for earmarks. So there isn't a special pot of money. So the only federal highway money that's likely to go into this project comes out of the federal money that comes to the states to keep up the existing roads. So if we put federal money that we get in Washington and Oregon into this project, it'll be because we're taking it away from other projects that we could spend it on and other road maintenance around the state. I'll just skip over a couple of these because I want to talk about transit funding. You all know that a major component of this project is including light rail in the bridge. And the plan for light rail assumes that the federal government will provide about $850 million in money for light rail through what's called the New Starts program. And if you read the fine print in the chart, in the financial plan, it says, well, that number isn't guaranteed. We don't know exactly what it is. It'll have to be negotiated. And if it turns out that the federal government puts in less than $850 million, guess who has to make up the difference? It's state and local governments here in the region. And they're hoping for a huge amount of money from the federal government. Almost all, about 90% of the cost of light rail under their plan, in theory, would be paid for by the federal government. But the federal government almost never pays more than 50% of the cost of light rail projects. And they're counting on what I would call kind of a stealth earmark that Senator Patty Murray got put in a transportation bill 4 years ago that allows the Federal Transit Administration to count the highway portion of the CRC as the local matching money for the light rail project. Now that's completely untested, and there's nothing in that law that requires FTA to pay for 90% of the project. They could pay for a lot less, which is exactly what they did in the case of Portland's new Portland to Milwaukee light rail project, where TriMet for years was counting on the federal government paying 60%, and then ultimately the federal government only paid 50%, even though it could have paid more. And again, if the federal government decides to put in less money than the CRC planners hope for, who has to make up the difference? And the answer is state and local governments. So I'll just skip a couple of things here and talk about the financial state of the highway funding system in Washington State, because it's a huge risk. Washington is expected to put up $450 million of its money for its starting share of the Columbia River crossing. But the state highway budget in Washington, which goes out for several years, doesn't have any money for the CRC. There are a couple of other very big mega projects already underway in the Seattle area: the 520 floating bridge, the Alaska Way Viaduct deep bore tunnel replacement project, which are both multi-billion-dollar projects, and both of which have huge holes in them. That is, they've started the project, but they don't yet have the money to finish them. Which, by the way, that should be a very serious cause for concern when you're working with an agency that starts building something that doesn't have the money to finish it. Because that's what CRC looks like as well. But in any event, those two projects are clearly ahead of the line of CRC. And for the past decade or more, WashDOT, this Washington Department of Transportation, has been adding to its debt burden. It's been putting new highway projects, if you will, on the credit card. And in about 2 or 3 years, WashDOT will be spending 70% of the new revenue that comes in from the gas tax in Washington on bonds to pay for the projects that it did in the past. And the 30% that's left is not even enough to keep up the highway system that we've got. So Washington's transportation system is in serious trouble, and Oregon is following close behind. Again, Oregon is expected to put up $450 million, but our costs will be a lot higher than that. That's true for both states. $450 million is sort of the down payment. Once you sign the contract on this project, your liabilities are largely unlimited. And WashDOT, like WashDOT, Oregon is running out of money. I won't read that whole memo for you. Its debt service has increased as well. 10 years ago, Oregon's Department of Transportation was essentially debt-free. It spent about 1% of its budget repaying loans for previous projects. Right now, it's spending 29% of its budget repaying bonds for old projects. And today, the Oregon House voted to put its share of the Columbia River crossing on the credit card as well, and that'll push up the amount of money that goes into debt service as well. And like Washington, Oregon has overestimated the amount of money that it's going to get from gas tax. The red line is what Oregon thought it was going to get from gas tax. The blue line is what it's actually getting. And again, it's because we can't afford to buy as much gasoline as they thought we were going to buy 5 years ago. But the result is we have less money at these state departments of transportation to pay for anything, including new projects. The final risk that I want to talk about is the risk of cost overruns. This construction project, if undertaken, would be the most expensive construction project ever undertaken in the Portland-Vancouver area at about $3.4 billion, or at least that's their current estimate. And there are good reasons to believe that a multi-billion-dollar project like this, that's very complicated, that includes transit, that crosses a major river, that has to be built in an area where there's a lot of traffic on a day-to-day basis, where there are unknown risks out there, is likely to encounter cost overruns. A global study of billion-dollar bridge and highway projects found that on average, billion-dollar-plus bridges went 30% over budget. And on this project, 30% of $3.4 billion is more than $1 billion. And again, if this project goes over budget, the federal government doesn't pay more, and there isn't any more toll revenue to pay for it. The taxpayers of Oregon and Washington are liable to pay for it if there are cost overruns. And I don't have to tell you, because Tiffany will, the project's track record of maintaining its budget so far is not very encouraging. Oregon Department of Transportation, which is doing a number of projects around the state, all of its large projects have gone 200% or more over budget. They have a project between Newport and Corvallis, Newport on the Oregon coast, Corvallis in the Willamette Valley. It's a 5-mile long highway widening project. It was supposed to cost a little over $100 million. The latest estimate is it will cost about $400 million and will be 5 or 6 years behind schedule. And its other big projects have similarly gone over budget. If you have that kind of inflation on this project, it essentially eats up all the transportation resources in the Portland area and the state of Oregon for years to come. Washington has had its own cost overruns that have not been as dramatic, but are equally troubling and were flagged by your state auditor. And then there's a big risk because of the kind of way they want to contract for it, which is called design build. I won't go into the details on that. And if there were a representative of the CRC here, they would tell you, don't worry, everything's fine, because we have something called a CEVP, a cost estimate validation process that we use to make sure that we don't go over budget. And they've told repeatedly the two legislatures that, don't worry, this will take care of it. The only trouble is, when the governors of the two states a couple of years ago appointed an independent review panel, they said the CEVP wasn't accurate, had significant risks, wasn't reliable, and wasn't credible. And we also know that the CEVP process, for example, failed to detect little problems like they weren't building the bridge high enough to provide for clearance for ships to go under it. So the CEVP process doesn't protect us against cost overruns. So I'll just conclude there and leave some time for questions. But all of the key factors behind this bridge, the toll forecasts, the reliance on very optimistic assumptions about the availability of federal highway and transit funds, and the deteriorating financial condition of the two states' transportation departments mean that there are very big risks to the taxpayers of Oregon and Washington if we move forward with this project. And they're things that we should consider much more carefully than we have done so far before we take another step. Thank you.